Okay, good morning. Time now 8 a.m. A few minutes past at the 8 a.m. Thursday, November 10th in Tokyo time. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank online seminar organized by the World Bank Tokyo office. My name is Koichi Omori. I am a Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. In our morning seminar programs, we feature the latest World Bank report put together by the World Bank economist and expert, having them as a presenter to share the main point of those report with the Japanese audience or audience in Japan in a virtual manner. This morning, we are extremely pleased to have the team from the Environment Department. We are going to feature the new report, which is titled, Where is the Value in the Chain? Pathways Out of Plastic Pollution. And then we have three presenters this morning joining from Washington. In fact, we are going to have another one joining later as a discussant. But let me very briefly introduce each one of them. First, we have a pleasure of having Delphine Ali, who is the Senior Environment Engineer from the Natural Resources Blue Economy Global Practice, connecting us from Washington. Delphine, good evening, good morning to you. Thank you very much for joining. Great. Then we do have Milagros Aim, who is the environment engineer from the same team, connecting us from Washington. Milagros, good morning, good evening to you. Hope you can hear me. Okay, great. Thank you. And then we do have one more speaker who is the Uju Dim, the economist from the same team, connecting us, I think, from Washington too. Uju, good morning, good evening. Thanks for joining. And then later we are going to have Grzegorz Peszko, who is a leader economist from the same team as a discussant. So actually we have him right now connected. Thank you very much for joining. Super. So after listening to their keynote presentation, as usual, we are going to read the question that we received from the viewer. Thank you very much for sending your question in advance. If you did not have opportunity to send your question in advance, as usual, please send your question by using the online form posted on the web page announcement of this seminar, or you can simply post your question on the chat section of the YouTube screen. I will read your question after their keynote presentation, asking the speakers to respond. With that, I'd like to ask perhaps Delphine to come in first to start or kick off the presentation. And then after that, we'll have a discussion. Delphine, over to you.
Thank you so much, Koichi. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here tonight. Very happy to kick off this presentation. I'm going to provide a quick introduction, and then I will hand over to Milagros to speak about the plastic substitution trade-off estimator, and then to Uju to present the plastic policy simulator, and then I'll conclude with a few slides. So the topic that brings us today, as you can see here on the screen, we have been looking at pathways out of plastic pollution, and I'm going to present the context behind the publication, where is the value in the chain. We will share the presentation and the link as part of this event. So the statements that we are starting from is to say that we all have seen plastic ubiquitous in modern life. And in recent decades, however, the downside of the plastic consumption to society has become apparent as plastic waste has become omnipresent, reduced costs to the environment, to livelihoods, to biodiversity, and to human health, on top of high contributions to greenhouse gas emission all along the plastic life cycle. So I'm flagging this issue as we are entering in the COP27 discussions, and the contribution of plastic within that agenda is significant and is very relevant to countries. So despite the commitments from the governments and the private sector to address plastic pollution, we have seen that there has been a limited success of policies due to a number of market and policy failures. So we are going to try in this presentation today to see how we are recommending to address those issues. And basically, we have identified 3 main buckets of issues that are coming from those 3 points that I'm presenting in this slide. So first is looking at the incentive gap between the upstream and the downstream entry points along the life cycle of plastics. There are lack of incentives to influence decisions from producers and consumers, and a very important focus on the downstream part of the life cycle, looking at the waste management problem and plastic being one part of the waste streams, but it's not enough and more is needed. What we see also is that there has been fragmented and incoherent government interventions where countries could focus, for example, on bans only or on some issues on EPRs, but they're not necessarily looking at the whole systemic issue that needs to be considered. And then there is no consideration of environmental and societal costs of plastics. So based on that statement, we've been looking at the different pathways to get out of plastic pollution and to address plastic pollution issues. We've identified through the work that you will see now a number of tasks that policymakers can consider. And on that diagram, which I'm sorry is very complex and very difficult to read on the screen, but basically what we are saying is that you can start with the measurements. A lot of efforts have been put into data collection, baseline diagnostics, doing some modelings of the most damaging plastics, the most harmful to the environment, or what are the material flows through the economy and the environment. And there are a number of tools and methodologies that have been developed, such as top 10 items, in the environment studies, or looking at waste flow diagrams, or the national assessment and modeling tool that has been developed by the Global Plastic Action Partnership. But we've been trying to focus on, in this work, on how can we set targets. And Milagros is going to talk about that. And then we recommend to assess and identify technical measures, at least cost to the society, which is a very important aspect of the discussion. And then what kind of policies are available and how did they perform elsewhere? So in this report here that we call Toward Experience-Based Policy Guidance, we are trying to draw lessons from 10 governments and state governments that have been making attempts in the last 10, 20 years to address plastic policy, plastic management and waste management, and to try to identify the key successes and the principles that can be followed for policy making. And then Uju will present the Plastic Policy Simulator, which is another tool that we have developed to look at basically who bears the costs, who are the winners and losers of policy reforms, how to incentivize agents' behaviors and investments using policy reforms as the way to achieve those objectives. And we have identified tasks for policymakers that we are listing here on the left side of the slides. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit further once we have done the presentation. And here I'm going to hand over to Milagros to present the first key policy and knowledge gaps that we have tried to address, which is on the plastic substitution trade-off estimator. Milagros, over to you.
Thank you, Delphine. Good morning, everyone. It's a big pleasure to join you today and share one of the 2 models that we developed, that is the plastic substitution trade-off estimator. Next slide, please. So this model compares the costs and the benefits of 10 plastic products with up to 4 alternatives each currently available in the market. These 10 plastic products that were included in the model are basically the ones that are more commonly found leaking into the environment. It's designed to be applied at the country level, and it's a data-driven model that was piloted in 5 countries. The idea is that this model can help answer questions like, what are the external costs and effects of banning single-use plastic products? under which circumstances do alternatives really perform better than the currently used plastic products? And at the end of the day, what are the trade-offs of substituting these products? So with this, it helps understand the trade-offs along the entire life cycle, as we will see in a few slides. And with this support, inform decision-making for target setting, which was, as Delphine was showing in the previous slide, one of the first steps in the policy process. Important to emphasize that this is a tool. It's designed to be implemented in any given country, and it's not a piece of work that provides the one and only best alternative to a certain plastic product everywhere in the world. On the contrary, what it shows is that best alternatives will depend on really country context, how mature is the solid waste management system, what are the options for the end of life fate of both the plastic products and the alternatives, that is, are they being recycled, are they being reused, etc. So the model basically works in 3 steps: inputs, calculation, and outputs. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. So in terms of inputs, the model can be run with really minimal data, as it provides some default values with these minimal inputs. But of course, the more specific the data, then the better the results are going to be, the more tailored they're going to be to the country context. So for this, we basically need most of the information that is obtained in material flow analysis. It's about production, consumption, end-of-life fate. And again, important to emphasize that not only the plastic products, but also the alternatives. Next slide, please. So we said the model can be applied to 10 plastic products, and here they are. They're fishing nets, beverage bottles, beverage cups and food containers, shopping bags, disposable utensils, food wrappers, sachets, beverage cartons, clothing, and diapers. These are the ones that are normally more problematic in most of the countries. And for each of them, you see in this slide that there are between 3 and 4 alternatives that can also be modeled. Important to note that it's not necessary to use the model for all 10 plastic products. If there's a certain interest in looking only at shopping bags, then the model can be run only for that. Next slide, please. Okay, so to anyone familiar with the life cycle assessment or LCA methodology, this is what this slide is showing. The comparison is really not based on, it's really not a one-to-one weight-based comparison, but it's a comparison based on an equal function. This is one of the most important aspects or definitions in any life cycle assessment. So here we have all the functional units, and of course, if we are to replace a certain plastic shopping bag, the alternatives need to be so that they can still provide the same function. So in this case, is the capacity to carry 10 kilograms, for example. Next slide, please. The tool is looking at all the stages in the life cycle, from upstream on the extraction and feedstock production to the very downstream part, whether that's open burning, landfilling, incineration with or without energy recovering, or if the materials are recovered and then looped back into the system through recycling. Next slide, please. I'll try not to go too much into details because we don't have much time, but then if we have any questions, of course, we're here to answer. Again, going to the methodology, the model combines the LCA with an external cost analysis to complement the assessment and the results, as we are going to see in a few slides. Next slide, please. So here, first of all, I apologize for the size of this, but basically what we are showing is that we are looking at a total of 30 impacts or effects. That means that we are not only looking at, for example, GHG emissions, which is typically what is considered in when comparing trade-offs between plastics and alternatives. So this these impacts include or effects include water use, land use, time spent in washing and reusable diapers in the case of that product, or impacts on fishing vessels or arising from ghost fishing in the case of fishing nets. Next slide, please. Now, what is new about this tool is that not only does it allow it to tailor the analysis to a country context, but also that it went a step beyond and tries to monetize these impacts. That is to estimate the costs related to the impacts that are generated by the use and disposal of both the plastics and the alternatives. Due to the available information, this could be done only for some of the 30 effects that we were seeing in the previous slide. But even for those for which this is not possible at the moment, the tool provides two other types of outputs. Next slide, please. Those are the quantitative assessment that allows the user to still see and communicate results easily in relevant metrics, even though they're not in US dollars. We see here, for example, kilograms of CO2 equivalent, or cubic meters of water use. Next slide, please. And then the last output is a qualitative assessment. So this is for those impacts that could not be monetized nor quantified at this stage. So this is a relative assessment that assigns positive or negative value to alternatives based on whether their use will or is expected to result in lower or higher external costs. But just we cannot quantify that right now, or at least not in a way that was feasible to include in a model. So with this, we have three kinds of outputs: those impacts that could be monetized, and then we have a quantitative and a qualitative assessment. Now, all this information, how do we visualize it in the model in a way that it really allows comparison, allows the understanding of the trade-offs, and at the end of the day, informs target setting? Next slide, please. So we can see the results in three ways. The first one is the side-by-side comparison, where we can see how the plastic product performs against each of its alternatives. In this slide, we can see on the right what would be for the plastic product, but that same information would be available for the 3 or 4 or 2 alternatives that were modeled. So this is the information for each of them. Next slide, please. But then also, at the end of the day, we want to see if we want to see how the plastic product and the alternatives perform when it comes to particulate matter formation or acidification or ecotoxicity in fresh water, then we have also this, the model also has these ways of visualizing the results and understand the trade-offs. Next slide, please. And then we have two other ways of visualizing the results, which are the scenario comparison, which models the result if a certain plastic product was to be replaced by not only one alternative, but a combination of alternatives. For example, PET bottles being replaced by 20% aluminum cans, 20% glass bottles, and another 50% reusable PP bottles. And finally, the aggregate scenario, which is bringing together all the scenario comparisons for the 10 plastic products. Next slide, please. As with any model, and I try to finish with this, the estimator is a simplification of reality, and it and therefore has its limitations. It can be used to assess the effectiveness of regulatory schemes and policies. It cannot be used to assess the financial implications of product substitution, nor affordability and acceptability by users of the alternative materials. Next slide, please. I don't think we will go through these details now. It's just when we apply this model in countries, we see it as 4 steps, and as an iterative process. Where most of the value is really in the iterative part and the conversation, validation of data and results with stakeholders, so that the results that to which the model arrives can really inform target setting. So with this, I will stop and hand over to Uju. Thank you.
Thank you, Milagros. So today I'm going to present to you the Plastic Policy Simulator, or otherwise called the PPS, which is a complementary model to the Plastic Substitution Trade-off Estimator, which Milagros just presented. Because after the government finishes setting targets, then the government can then use the PPS to simulate the different impacts of the policies it wishes to implement on the various agents. Next slide, please. So basically, the PPS is a techno-financial fiscal model for policy analysis, and it is designed to facilitate policy dialogue and to quantify the impacts of policy instruments on key economic actors in the plastic value chain, such as the firms operating in the value chain, the households, and also different forms of government. And it's a country-level model, but it can also be applicable in subnational levels. And it was first piloted in Indonesia. So the PPS tries to answer some questions, such as how can policies change the flow of plastic through the economy from the to the environment? So what fraction of plastic waste ends up in, say, landfills or ocean, or what percentage is being incinerated? So it also tries to quantify the financial, fiscal, and employment impacts on firms, households, and governments. And lastly, it tries to see who benefits and who loses from the policies which the government is implementing to address plastic pollution. Next slide. So, and why should country be interested in the PPS model for plastic management? So why this model is important is that it's the first of its kind to model various impacts of plastic policy instruments on multiple economic actors. And the policy instruments which it takes into account is very comprehensive, and I'm going to show you in a bit. And also it's used to navigate public consultations about complex policy reforms with uncertain with winners and losers. So it simulates expected impacts before implementing policy. So it's an ex-ante model which the government can use before it implements a policy, and this would help reduce costly mistakes. And lastly, identify potential strategy synergies and conflicting incentives between policy instruments, because you can simulate different mixes of policies to see what their impacts are. Next slide. So now I'm going to run you through the structure or the architecture of the model. So the model takes into account 20 individual plastic product types that are aggregated into 5 categories. And these products are also one of the most commonly found in the environment. It's divided into bottles, other rigid monomaterials, flexible monomaterials, multi-materials, and cigarette butts. And the percentages you see are the fraction of these different categories in the plastic waste for Indonesia. So the numbers can be different for Japan or for any country, depending on what the mix is. And examples of these plastic products are water bottles, for example, disposable utensils, carrier bags, sachet, and so on and so forth. So it's quite broad, or it covers a broad range of plastic products. And next, we take into account the menu of 24 policy instruments which have been applied next slide, please, which has been applied around the world. And examples of these policies are mandatory modulated EPR fees, virgin plastic excise tax on all packaging, landfill taxes, and also subsidies or public financing for, say, alternative materials and reuse system, mechanical and chemical recycling, or subsidy of public financing for landfill and incinerators. Also, it looks at bans and standards such as plastic labeling, product restriction and bans, mandatory product design, and also complementary policies such as behavioral change, where it looks at the purchase decisions or where the government tries to influence purchase decisions of consumer, and also waste management decisions. And lastly, looks at governance in terms of the improvements in the governance systems. And in the next slide, we see that apart from all this, it also takes into account the key economic agents in the plastic value chain. So it takes into account the government, and there we look at the fiscal impacts on the government, and then also firms operating in the upstream and downstream sector of the plastic value chain. So think about the plastic producers of alternatives, converters, consumer goods companies, consumers and households, farmer collectors, incinerators operators, and so on. So all the major, even informal sector, so all the major key stakeholders in the plastic value chain are taken into account. And in the next slide, we see that it divides the country, in this case Indonesia, into different geographical archetypes. And this is because we know that the different geographies have different waste generation patterns, different plastic consumption patterns. So it tries to classify these different types of geographies and see how the policies impact the different groups. And the good thing about the PPS in this case is that depending on where the model is being implemented, this archetype can be defined flexibly. So in Indonesia, the archetypes are mega cities, medium cities and suburban, peri-urban and dense rural, and then remote. But in a different country, it could be something totally different based on the local context in the country. And lastly, it looks at fiscal plastic flows and financial exchanges among the economic actors. So it adopts a systematic approach, looking at the different segments of the plastic value chain, and looks at the interactions between the different stakeholders, the different segments of the value chain. So, for instance, it looks at the exchange, both the financial and the plastic flows from, say, the production or producers to converters, and so on, and also how the plastic flow moves down to collection and sorting, then to recycling and managed or mismanaged waste. So it looks at the entire system to simulate the impact on the different key economic actors. So next, I'm going to present to you okay, so in terms of model outputs, what the PPS does is that it shows us the impacts on different factors. So for instance, the plastic fate, and here it shows us the plastic flows by destination. So again, what fraction of plastics are being recycled or being managed or mismanaged. So based on the implementation of certain policies or package of policies. And also the impacts on formal and informal firms. So how does these policies affect the investment choices of firms, or their costs and revenues, and even their profits? And then the impact on government. So how does it impact the fiscal revenues and expenditures at both national and subnational governments? And then how does it affect consumer behavior or choices, and also expenditure on plastic products. And lastly, looks at the impact on direct employment and greenhouse gas emissions in the plastic value chain. So next, I'm going to show you the simulation results and the insights which we got for Indonesia. For short of time, I'm just going to show you a few results, but we have all the details of all the results we got in the report, which you can find online on the World Bank website. So one of the insights we got from applying this model in Indonesia is that the integrated policy reform incentivizes the achievement of all government targets by 2040. And what does this mean? So the integrated policy reform is a mix of policy, or is the scenario where the government implements a mix of policies in both the upstream and downstream sector. So the government implements a comprehensive package of policies, of 12 policies. And so some examples of the policies are EPR schemes, or EPR scheme, plastic packaging task, subsidies for collection and sorting, and so on and so forth. So, and the PPS is a scenario does scenario analysis where it simulates different scenarios. So the first scenario, which is a current policy scenario, is the case where no major policy intervention is made. So the policies which are already implemented or in place are taken into account, but no new policies are being put in place. And then the second scenario, which is B, is the scenario called subsidies for collection and sorting. And this is the traditional waste management approach where government funds the downstream part of the value chain. And lastly, the integrated policy reform scenario, which I just explained, is a mix of policies in both upstream and downstream. What we see is that in the current policy scenario, that's the case where the government does nothing. Mismanaged waste is at 68%, while managed waste is about 20%. But if the government implements a mix of policies to address plastic pollution and plastic management, we see that the mismanaged waste becomes 18%, so around 50% less compared to the case where the government does nothing. And recycling, for example, increases by 14%. So in the next slide, we have another result where we see that the integrated policy reform scenario will achieve more with less burden on public budget, which is, or people would think that it doesn't make sense since the government is spending for this policy, but this is what it is. So the light blue bars are the revenues of the government. So the government gets revenue from household fees and from virgin taxes, but it also has some savings from EPR fees, which are funded by the private sector, or where the private sector funds collection and sorting. So, and then in terms of cost, obviously, based on the policies which the government is implementing, it incurs some administrative costs, for example, or so because some of the policies are public financing and for formal collection, formal sorting, for landfilling. So those are costs to the government. The government is also conducting consumer education campaigns. So all these are costs to the government. But then when we look at the net fiscal impact, so the difference between the revenue which the government gets and saves versus the cost, we see that in the integrated policy reform scenario case, that's the case where the government implements a comprehensive mix of policies. the net fiscal burden is around $1 billion. But in the current policy scenario case where the government does nothing, but for instance, we know waste generation is still the same, plastic consumption is still the same at the same pace. The government spends around about 1.4 billion. So the government is spending more in the case where it does nothing compared to where it implements plastic management policies. So this is a very interesting insight from the Indonesia case study. And lastly, we have results that shows that in the integrated policy reform scenario, there will be a shift in the profits in the plastic value chain from linear and polluting to circular and sustainable firms. And this is because given the incentives or the policies which are being implemented, the firms are now more interested in, say, recycling, informal waste management. So if you look at the bars, the blue bars are for the current policy scenario case, which is the case the government does nothing, and the green bars is the integrated policy scenario case. And if we see for the profits for plastic producers and converters, relatively stays the same, but then we see an increase from recyclers and formal waste management and also informal waste pickers. And this is because of the shift in activities based on the incentives which the government the government has put in place. So these are some of the results which we got from implementing the PPS model in Indonesia, and also these are the kind of results one can get from implementing it in other countries. And just to wrap up, we see that these kinds of give the government the information or knowledge about what the impact of the policies which they are planning to implement would be, because they can implement or they can simulate results for single policies or mix of policies. In this case, we mostly dwelled on the integrated policy reform case in the Indonesian context. In another country, it could be different mix of policies based on the targets which the government has. So this is very flexible, and one can really generate interesting insights from applying the PPS model. Thank you very much. I now pass it on to Delphine to wrap up.
Thank you, Uju, for your presentation, and thank you, Milagros. So now that you've heard about those tools and you had some insights thanks to Uju and Milagros on what type of results, how can they be used, we wanted to spend just a few minutes as a conclusion to elevate this discussion in terms of what does this mean for countries. In reality, in concrete, obviously this discussion feed into the international discussion that's happening at the UN level. And I'm sure that you're all aware of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee that's going to happen in Uruguay at the end of the month. So we've tried to look into a number of principles that can help inform the efforts of countries in addressing the plastic pollution in their countries. So one of the key points that I want to flag is that, as Uju and Milagros have explained, those tools are part of an iterative and transparent process. And that's something that's very important as the countries develop their strategy. So here's the first point we want to flag. As countries develop their strategies and national action plans, that needs to be tailored to country context. And I think that we've had some good insight from the results presented just now by Uju on what the plastic policy simulator can do. And I think what's important is to really get a clear understanding of the policy landscape. And that's also what the plastic policy simulator can do. It can show to countries what are the menu of options that can be looked at, but also what are the trade-offs that come with certain policy instruments and with certain alternatives, going back to the presentation that Milagros did. And in both cases, what we see also is that there are trade-offs in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. That's an important point. What we see in the plastic policy simulator is that there is a possibility, while implementing a coherent package of policies, to reduce the emissions that would have happened in a business as usual scenario. There are also opportunities for job creation if those kind of policies are implemented. So what we are advising policymakers is to do these ex-ante simulations on policy impacts on various economic agents as the development of national action plans is being done. And also the process of setting targets, as we can see when we look at the different alternatives, has to be informed by the full social cost of plastics and alternative. And we can elaborate further in the discussion around those aspects. And then we're speaking about combining policy instruments in a coherent way. So what does this mean? I think that there is a consensus in countries internationally that the solutions have to come from all along the plastic life cycle. So here what we're trying is to show how can this be done and what does this mean. So it requires the creation of sustainable markets. That's a very important point that we see. Incentives and policy instruments can enable sustainable markets to be created. And that's something that we've seen and we've heard from Uju. We need also upstream incentives that are essential for circularity. It's about the design of products. We talk a lot about the recycling criteria and designing for recycling. It's also looking at multi-use products, something that we've learned from the plastic substitution trade-off estimator that Milagros presented. Of course, we need to improve solid waste management systems. And in some countries, that's the basic requirements to really provide access to solid waste, to basic solid waste management in the country. And also these comprehensive policy packages that, for example, Uju has given us some insight on, must be implemented or can be implemented in sequence, depending on the level of data, depending on the level of governance in a country. A step-by-step approach can help in developing those policy packages. And the third point that's very important, and that comes from all the tools that we have developed, is really about considering the true cost of plastics and their alternatives. So comparing the full life cycle cost of single-use plastic is an essential step to understand those different trade-offs, but also to consider the true cost of recycled plastics, for example, versus the virgin plastic ones. And this is very important to compare the cost and benefits of the different action and technical measures, as well as the cost of alternatives when we look into those aspects. So how can those tools help countries? So as I said, as a wrap-up, in the international context that's happening now, the Pathways tool provide policymakers with guidance, and when we talk about the policy of options, so that's a roadmap, a forward-looking models that helps provide insights on what can be done, what could be the effects, and then transparency and evidence to plastic management dialogues and target setting with the various actors that are involved in those discussions. So I would like to thank Milagros and Uju, but also Grzegorz, who has been leading with me this work that we are very happy to present to you today. And now we are available for your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Delphine, Milagros, and Uju making a presentation, sharing the main findings of the report. Really appreciate it. We received several questions from the viewers in advance, and actually those questions came in advance to the presentation. So you may have already touched upon the issues raised by the audience, but let me read the questions asking you to come in to respond. And let me read actually three questions together. The first one, although the regulations like Basel laws sometime being imposed, plastics are imported and exported. How do you analyze plastic waste management in the countries that are not members of the OECD, importing plastics from other countries? That's one. And then the second question from the same person, even the whole mechanism shift to LCA based or life cycle analysis based. Are there still some uncertainties? There are still uncertainties such as disasters and plastic product may flash by float, for example. How do you put into such uncertainties into the cycle model? That's the second point. Then a third question from the same person about social cost. There are many other social costs by plastic or alternative resource materials usage, including humanitarian costs related with resource. How would you evaluate the trade-off among such complex matters? So these are the 3 points raised by the same viewers. If you have any comment, respond from the team, I would like to ask you to come in, please.
Thank you, Koichi. So we're trying to organize our answers, also cognizant of time. I'm going to ask Milagros maybe first to answer on what's the kind of trade-off and the LCA-based mechanism question. Maybe Milagros, if you can start with that, and if you have any insights on the other aspect, please feel free to step in as well. And then I'll hand over to Grzegorz for the other questions. Thank you.
Josephine. And yes, that's a very good question. There are many uncertainties, and the question really is, how do we assess them? What would be a good metric to assess them, and then be able to compare and analyze the trade-offs? In fact, we find ourselves with those questions when developing the model. So in the case of flooding and drainages being clogged by either plastic products or other streams of waste, we found that currently there was no way to quantify and then monetize that impact, at least not in a way that it could be included in a model that should be comprehensive enough to consider as many impacts as possible, but at the same time not as complicated that then it would be almost impossible to apply due to data constraints that normally we find in our client countries. All this to say, in the case of flooding, then this was included in the model under the qualitative assessment. If you remember from the presentation, we had the monetized assessment, the monetized effects, then a quantitative and qualitative assessment to complement what could not be monetized. So this is the way we found that it could be still included. But in any case, if there was a country that has that data available, then this can be inserted in the model and assign costs to other impacts that nowadays are kind of an uncertainty. Thank you.
Thank you, Milagros. Grzegorz Uju would like to please come in to comment on the imports and how it's considered in the PPS. Maybe Grzegorz, if you can start with that, and also the social cost. I think that's a very important question that we've also tried to look at.
Thank you, Delphine. So the plastic policy simulator does require data about the plastic products that are either produced and plastic polymers and then plastic products that are either produced domestically in a country or they are imported. So this way or another, it should be covered in the material flow analysis that goes as input to the model. And certainly the policy instruments that are available in the model are designed to apply both to imported and domestically produced products, such as, for instance, if we impose the plastic virgin plastic tax or plastic tax on all packaging, just as with any good tax design, you don't want to discriminate between the materials or products that are domestic versus imported. So they apply to consumption of these products, no matter of their origin, but nonetheless, it is important to distinguish. And it is also important to distinguish when you are interpreting results. For instance, with the plastic policy simulator, we simulate the impact on job creation and destructions in different segments of the value chain when the policy incentive change. So for instance, when you introduce the EPR system with high fees, which is eco-modulated, you may increase the recycling rates, which benefits the recycling industry at home, but at the expense of some profits lost by the producers of virgin plastics. So that means that we also look at the jobs created both among the producers of virgin plastic materials, producers of polymers, converters of these polymers to products, consumer good companies, and so forth, as well as in the downstream segments of the value chain among recyclers, waste collectors, and so forth. So you will see the shifts in the jobs created and destroyed between these different segments, and it will be important if the loss of profits for plastic producers of plastic polymers affects the foreign producers who are exporting it to your country, or whether it affects the profit pool of the producers in the country. So we just need to be aware and distinguish the impact between depending on the segment of the value chain, depending on whether it is domestic or foreign. But all this is absolutely covered in the scope of analysis. Maybe what is, I think, important from the plastic policy simulator as well is the recycling process that it. Oh no, it was not asked yet. I'm sorry. All right. So I don't know. Social cost for the. I think this is the question to Milagros, the social cost, and I think you already kind of covered it. Yeah, Delphine. That will be it from me.
Just to thank you, Gregor. Just to confirm, I think that the question that were about the social costs, I think that we look at the products, and I think that Milagros has explained what are the assumptions that can be taken, and what's important is to look into the difference between the quantitative and the qualitative aspect. So I think that she's covered that question in that way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We do have 6 minutes, so probably we can do one more round. So let me read a list of other questions that we received from the viewers in advance. The first one, the informal sector intervention is mentioned in the report. Does the report analyze the health issues of the workers in informal sector? That's one. And the second one, even though recycling process being enhanced, ultimately it requires some form of waste management at some point. What does it look like in the future? And then let me add actually one more. I know the report is targeted to the government as of offering a policy tool for them. From the report perspective, how does the private sector fit in the discussion? What would be the space for the private sector to come in the tool? So that's 3 sets of questions. I would like to ask Delphine to orchestrate the responses from the team. Thank you.
Thank you, Koichi. So I think that there is one answer that on the health impacts. It's still an area of research. So this one, we have not been able to look at the health impact of waste sectors, of waste pickers, in the sense of what are the impacts of one policy instrument on the health of the waste pickers. So this is something that is a very important issue, but it's not something that we can model in either of the tools that we have here. They are fully part of a different discussion that would be on improvement of waste management, how to fit into the informal and the formal sector. And there is also a gender dimension in that question that I think is very important that we discussed, but we haven't the data to actually include those in the monitoring. So I think that's a very short answer. Maybe on your question on recycling process and how it requires for some waste management at one point. Maybe I can ask Grzegorz or Uju to jump in here on how it's considered in the model, but the short answer is yes, and then we can provide more detail. Please, Grzegorz, if you can step in on this one.
Yeah, so the waste management options after the recycling will depend again on the policy choices that are made by a country. For instance, if under the current recycling systems, most of it is so-called open loop recycling. That means that the material recovered from the recycled products is used only once, usually to make something else, which later on is discarded on the landfill or goes into environment. With the right policy incentives, some countries are changing the flow of plastic waste from open loop recycling to the closed loop recycling, where you don't see this downgrade of the quality of the product, so you can basically use the same material to produce the same food grade bottles over and over and over again. Eventually, it will end up on the landfill, but it can have many more useful lives before. Some countries decide to subsidize waste incineration. So the products that are recycled can go to the incinerator, and again, with or without energy recovery. All these technologies, all these options are available in the plastic value chain map that we use in the plastic policy simulator. And the way that the plastic flows to the recycling, to different recycling streams, open versus closed loop, and then what is their further destination really depends on the policy incentives that are affecting the investment and behavioral decisions of many different actors in this value chain, from the upstream producers and users of plastics, consumers, all the way down to what's more commercially viable for the companies operating in the waste management system.
Thank you, Grzegorz. So the last question was on the private sector and how it fits into the report scopes. It's a short answer is it completely fits into the whole approach. Milagros, can you please give us an example on how you've looked at private sector in the PSTE, and then we can expand a little bit before we close.
Yes, so indeed, while the models are mostly thought or targeted for government in terms of informing target setting and then the policy design, this does not mean at all that the private sector is not involved. We mentioned that for both models, the iterative process and the whole consultation process with stakeholders for both the data and the results is critical. So that's one important step where the private sector needs to be fully engaged. When we look at alternatives and trade-offs also, who is going to provide alternative materials in a certain country or in a certain context? It's normally the private sector. So that's another entry point for the private sector in this conversation. And very importantly also, through the plastic substitution trade-off estimator, we can play with the weight of the products, for example. So for the alternatives, there are some default values, but as we said today, the comparison is based on an equal function. So whether that is done, the same function is done with a certain bottle or a certain bag of a material that weighs more or less. This will depend on the context and the alternatives that are available. But then this is where the private sector could come in and start thinking about designing, how to influence the design so that less material is used for some of these products. And then this, of course, has a direct impact on the results of the model.
Thank you, Milagros. Koshi, do we have time for just another comment? I think Grzegorz can bring some insight from the what I mentioned in the conclusion on sustainable markets and how it is important to bring in the private sector. I mean, the way we look at that is when we speak about enabling environments, government are the enablers that can provide the policies to give incentives. And then the private sector are the actors who will actually act on it. So maybe if we have 2 minutes, maybe we can bring in Grzegorz for more insight on that.
Yeah, I mean, every good regulation is a regulation that has some certain buy-in from those who are regulated. So certainly, especially in the design of the regulatory package for making plastic more circular and reduce plastic pollution, we need instruments that are agreeable by the private sector. We need this consultation process. However, there's also a risk of regulatory capture, and many policy instruments create winners and losers, as Delphine said at the beginning. So the ultimate outcome of the policy reform process may mean that some part of the private sector will not like the outcomes of the policy reform because others will benefit more. So yeah, it is super important, and the tools that we have designed are meant to engage both the regulators and the regulated community and the civil society in this dialogue, in the dialogue that is transparent, that is open, that keeps all the options on the table, and shows in real time and before the policies are implemented and investments are made. So in which directions these policy reforms can lead, so as to identify, the future political economy issues and the need for perhaps compensation, especially of the households that sometimes may experience some changes in the disposable income. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. We had a pleasure of having Delphine, Ali, Grzegorz Pesko, Milagros Eim, and Ruju Dim from connecting from Washington, D.C., presenting the main point of the new report. Fair is a value in the chain pathways out of the plastic pollution. Thank you very much, all of you, for your time with us. Thank you very much. Great. So we are going to, thank you. Next week, we are going to feature the Middle East and North Africa economic update, which was released last month. This is going to be at 8 a.m. on Friday next week. And also, if you are interested in working together with the World Bank, here's the opportunity. We are going to have the career seminar featuring the Diarietu Guy, our Vice President for Human Resources, visiting Washington starting today. And then this career seminar is going to be in the Tuesday evening next week. And then you would be able to participate in the virtual format if you would want to do so, joining from the remote place. So please find the information on our website. With that, I would like to once again thank you very much for your joining, and see you next week. Thank you.
It's fine.
Thank you.